Hello, beautiful people. I am Oliver Perrin for Semiagog, and I am joined this afternoon where I am at any rate, and very, very happy it is so. We are all lucky to be joined by Apostolic Majesty, who will be shedding light on the historical context, not only as initially planned, relative to relations between Poland and Russia, of course, Soviet Union at some points, I suppose, but the historical context for relations between Russia and Poland, but also Poland and Germany in that picture to some extent, to the degree we are able to bring that in, and also Ukraine as well. Basically, the idea here is to get necessary historical context for the themes and subjects that we have been looking at in the first two episodes of the Promethean strategies series. We weren't entirely sure it would be a series at first, but it has turned into one. And as events unfold in that part of the world, I think it's warranted. We will not be joined by Prudentialist and Charlemagne on this one. However, we do have a stream in the works. I won't go into too much detail on it, but it should be coming up as the fourth part in this series, and that will be with Prudentialist, with Charlemagne, and with MS again, with any luck. And in that one, we hope to explore aspects of Prometheanism and more recent doctrine that relate to Germany as well. For shilling, please do follow this channel, Semiagog, as well as a safer space. You can do that on BitChute. You can follow me on Gab. You can follow me over on Odyssey, and I hope you will. Telegram, Twitter, all those good things. Check out links for my books in the description below. But I do also want to recommend very strongly that if you are not already subscribed to Apostolic Majesty, check out the link in the description below. It is the first one in the description box. Head over to his channel. It is an enormous resource related to history for those of you who don't already know that. And the amazing thing, the happy thing, the fortuitous thing about the sort of historical content that he puts together is that it doesn't have an expiration date. It's not like, the latest hot take or, crass political punditry. You can go and look at all these different phases and aspects of history, and the material is evergreen. So I very, very strongly recommend everybody who hasn't done so already, head over there and subscribe to AM's channel. AM, welcome. I'm very, very happy to have you. Please introduce yourself briefly for everyone, and if there's anything you would like to shill, feel free to do so.
Hello, Semigog. It's wonderful to be back on your channel, and thank you so much for inviting me and for those very kind words concerning myself and my channel. I suppose I don't really need to do any shilling because you've already done the shilling for me, but yes, I've done a few streams as of late focusing on the diplomatic situation around World War I, if people are interested in that sort of thing. And indeed, I like to focus on global politics and a lot of political history, in the same vein as this conversation this evening, if you want to check out my channel. But other than that, thank you, Oliver, for having me on, and I hope this is going to be a interesting conversation, to say the least.
Well, given that you are my interlocutor, I feel sure it will be. It's going to be one of those usual things where I just try to keep up, even when you show up with a sort of informal preparation. I have to jog to keep up, so to speak. The way in which, well, I guess the best way to lay this out for you and for our viewers is, first of all, to just go back over very briefly what we've been looking at in this series. Charlemagne and Prudentialist and I were looking at what's been going on in the Ukraine and things with the Three Seas initiative and the intermarium and these other things, and we were all just sort of scratching our heads saying, are we looking here at an extension of these previous policies, or are these these policies the and initiatives and that sort of thing. Can we see a historical pattern reflected there? And is it one that is explicitly anti-Russian? And somebody popped into Twitter when I was asking about a question along these lines. I think it was back in the fall. And they said, yeah, man, you're just reinventing sliced bread. It's called Prometheanism. And it's Piłsudski, Marshal Piłsudski's a famous Polish military man and statesman. It's his doctrine, his strategy for dealing with the Russians. And I guess in his day, the Soviets, or for much of his day. And the basic idea of this approach of Piłsudski's is that Poland should endeavor to support regions of the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union, whichever happens to be the case, that have their own sort of ethnos, their own sort of nationalism, their own sort of sense of, if not real, at least potential independence from Russia. That Poland should support these countries and help to agitate, to get them to break loose from a Polish perspective of the dominance of Russia. And the basic idea is that nations that were or peoples and regions that were that could have been considered in the black column, so to speak, for Russia, would be moved over into the red column. They would be converted through this strategic alchemy of Piłsudski's from, let's say, assets to liabilities. A country like Ukraine, if under the control of Russia, brings to bear all of its mineral resources, its agriculture, its workforce, its human bodies for the military, its industrial capacity. If it's with Russia, those are all in the black column. It's something great for Russia to have that really magnifies its power and its reach. If you agitate for independence in the Ukraine, then what you do is you inflame nationalism there and wind it up and turn it around to go after Russia. Now, none of this is to suggest that these countries don't have, or regions or territories, depending on their circumstances at any point in history. This is not to suggest that these countries don't have their own long histories, their own sense of identity, their own governments, their own traditions. I'm not suggesting in any way that Piłsudski came along and went up and tried to tell the Balts that they were an independent people because they didn't know it already. I mean, that's preposterous, of course. So I just want to make it very clear that, of course, all these different countries and regions and peoples had their own independence movements before Piłsudski or the Poles came along. So that's the sort of background on this. We have seen, it looks like the United States explicitly picked up Promethean doctrine for a variety of reasons, not least among them, Poles or people of Polish descent in the U.S. government, in the State Department. That sort of thing. Brzezinski comes to mind. But it looks like the United States has really just pretty much picked up Prometheanism entire and is now applying it as a strategy, and it seems to serve two functions. One, it moves these assets from the black column to the red one for the Russians, makes life harder for the Russians, so to speak. But it also drives a neat wedge between Russia and Germany. And, I can't remember what the exact expression is, but you often hear people saying, keep NATO's job is to keep, Russia out and Germany down and the Americans in, or something along these lines. So you can see that there are ways in which Promethean fits the bill for that. Prometheanism fits the bill for that perfectly. So I guess we should, unless there is something, some other angle you think I'm missing here that you would want to introduce to the discussion, my thoughts were to begin by taking a look at the historical background for this, because as best I can tell, in their origins, Ukraine certainly and Russia have intertwined roots. And I think to a certain extent, there's this notion that's not entirely ridiculous of a sort of general sense or idea of Slavic peoples and the divisions that came with the church bifurcation, with sort of Catholics in the West and Orthodox in the East. There's background for that. I think there's also it's worth considering the fact that for most of its history, Ukraine was a borderland, and of course, its name, as you certainly know, just means the borderland. Um, so you've got a country that's literally named the borderland, and so that should give people in the West pause and make them consider, perhaps there's a whole lot more history going on here than most imagine. So yeah, that's my basic idea about how to start. What do you think?
Well, I suppose, there are several points you can bring up. You can either start this conversation by talking explicitly about the origins of Prometheanism, and by that I mean detaching various nationalities away from a Russian state. That's one. Or if you want to look at the origins of great power contrivance to keep Poland and a conglomeration of states around Poland alive to threaten both Germany or Russia or just one or the other. I suppose if you want to start that way, I mean, I can give a brief introduction to Pilsudski, and we can work backwards or forwards. I mean, it sort of makes sense to almost start with Pilsudski. We don't have to go through a sort of chronological history of Poland. I think that'll be overindulgent and not necessary for the nature of the points you want to bring out. So, just looking at Pilsudski in particular, he was a Polish ethnic Pole who was born in Vilnius within the Russian Empire. So he inherited this legacy of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And this is important in terms of understanding Poland, Lithuania, and its relationship with Russia. Because if I can, if I may, Semigog, I've got some maps which would really help illustrate my point regarding Prometheanism and why it originated in Russia and what the nationalities involved are, if that's all right. Okay. So this is a map of Poland, Lithuania at its zenith at the beginning of the 17th century. This is a amalgamation of several states. We have the Kingdom of Poland in the west. We have the Grand Duchy of Lithuania in the east, and we also have Livonia in the north. So broadly speaking, this is a state which encompasses ethnic Poles. We don't call them Ukrainians at this point, we call them Ruthenians. And Ruthenian is simply a Catholic Western interpretation of Rus, Russian. The distinction really between Russians in the East and Russians in the West is whether you refer to them as Russian or Ruthenian. And Ruthenian at this time also includes Belarusian as well. The distinction isn't so obvious when we're looking at this period. So the Ruthenian population, the Lithuanian population, a large Jewish population, a significant German population, and of course a Baltic population in the north. So looking at that map, Poland as has a fascinating historical legacy in the sense that it was a major power within its own right, and it had a claim to this multi-ethnic commonwealth, which at a time in the 17th century was more powerful and more of a factor in world diplomacy than the Muscovite state or Russia ever was. So, of course, the next 200 years go very badly for Poland. In the 18th century, the Polish state is partitioned, and maybe if you think it's relevant, Semigog, I can go into why Poland was partitioned and why, again, Poland would be partitioned during the just before the Second World War, or agreed to be partitioned with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But by 1815, you can see that Russia has gobbled up virtually all of the original Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. There is a stretch of land called Poznan in West Prussia, which has been given to Prussia, which later become Germany. This map doesn't really matter in terms of the western borders. Prussia will unite to become Germany. Austria will lose some territories, but Austria also has a significant Polish population as well. So Pilsudski is born in 1867. It's only 4 years since there's been a major Polish-Lithuanian revolt against the Russians, which has been backed by various foreign state actors, namely the British and the French. And over the course of the next 40 years or so, there is growing political agitation against the Tsarist system within Russia, to the extent that Tsar Alexander II, a Tsar who comes down very hard on Ukrainian nationalism or Ruthenian nationalism and Polish nationalism, is assassinated in 1881. And over the course of the reign of his son and his grandson, Alexander III and Nicholas II, there were various attempts to quote unquote Russify these provinces, which, like the Baltic states, had been more or less independent. Not independent in the sense that they were Baltic nation states within Russia, but rather there was a German elite who had essentially been given rights to rule this territory, as they had done for about 500 years up until this point. So when we see the political turmoil in Russia, when we see the advent of democratic socialist movements such as the social revolutionaries, they have their coinciding political organizations within all of these nations within the Russian Empire. It's not a Russian ethno-state. It is an empire. It is an empire which consists of myriad peoples, Muslims, Orthodox, Catholics, Jews. And on the Western Front, of course, it has the legacy of annexing this vast territory, which had been historically very distinct religiously and ethnically and politically from the rest of Muscovy. So Prometheanism as an ideology, if I'm supposed to understand it on a very sort of primitive level, obviously the mythical analogy is rather obvious. It is taking the fire from Zeus and giving it to mankind. In this case, mankind is the Baltic states, Poland, possibly Belarus and Ukraine, and other states also in the Caucasus. It should be envisaged, not just the intermarrying between the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea. And in this case, the fire would represent sovereignty and independence. And I think you and I had a conversation, Semigog, a long time ago, on pan-Tyrannism and these various designs by Finnish nationalists, because of course Finland was part of the Russian Empire as well at this point, to try and create some sort of ethnic coalition which would dismantle Russia. So you can say Prometheanism is actually a far less radical version of something like pan-Tyrannism. Rather than focusing on a wholesale dissolution of Russia, it is very much Polish centric, and it is very much focused on the resurrection of this space that you see here on this map. So I almost feel that Prometheanism is a bit of a misnomer, because if you apply it more liberally, Prometheanism could almost make sense for pan-Tyrannism. And I think you can almost say that the concept of the intermarium, or a restoration of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, is almost analogous to Greek independence. And what was the symbol most analogous with Greek independence? It was, of course, the phoenix rising from the flames. So I think that's just a very brief introduction as to what Prometheanism is. As for unless you want to sort of ask me any questions, Semigor, I can go into explaining how foreign powers would want to keep Poland as a means, essentially, of subduing Germany and subduing the Soviet Union.
Well, yes, and you had mentioned earlier as you were setting this forth that you might be able to go into the way in which those powers, um, might have had their fingers in the pie of Polish partition too, and how it was done. I'd be very interested to hear that, insofar as it bears on the broader topic. But I do want to underscore that interesting observation you made about Pan-Turanism, because of course the Turks were looking to ethnically agitate, as well as you of course know, the Central Asian Turkic republics, and ones that had a high proportion of Turks, if they weren't fully Turkish, if it was Tajiks or whatever it happened to be. That is very interesting, because it is ultimately the same strategy. Whereas you point out here that I guess what sets Prometheanism apart is its very specific geostrategic position vis-a-vis Western Europe on one side, Germany in particular, and Russia on the other. The only other thing I wanted to add would be that Prometheanism had the aspect of bringing in the Far East as well. It is said that Piłsudski was cooperating with the Japanese intelligence services, and that the Japanese pumped a fair amount of money into Promethean projects based on Piłsudski's thinking, because it was in their interest to kind of bookend Russia from either side. And today, of course, we're seeing that Poland is now cooperating with South Korea in terms of developing its own indigenous arms production industry, and is buying weapons of various kinds, tanks in particular, from South Korea. So when we think about this, there is certainly the geostrategic position of Poland where it is that I just mentioned. But the nature of the strategy is such that it can include, as sort of adjuncts or other facets of the strategy, bringing in people from the Far East in order to work on either bookending or encircling Russia in various ways. And it explicitly, once upon a time, I believe, included attempts to agitate, for example, the Kazakhs. So there is an aspect of Prometheanism that can sort of worm its way up into Central Asia, and that draws an even stronger parallel with the Turanism that you mentioned.
If I'm really to understand it, I would say the thing that distinguishes Pan-Turanism from Prometheanism, if we're to say that its ultimate objective is the dissolution, not necessarily the dissolution of Russia entirely, but the dissolution of Russian power, certainly Russia as a regional or even a great power. The way I would look at it is that Pan-Turanism obviously has its anchor in Finland and in Anatolia. And of course, depending on your liberal interpretation of Pan-Turanism, you could also include the Koreans, the Mongolians, and the Japanese in that. So of course, that coincides with your point quite well. However, Prometheanism to me seems like an extension of Polish power, and thereby this project is very much Polish-centric, and Japan being allied with this project would be more for ideological grounds than this revivalist nationalist idea that you see with Pan-Turanism. And very much I bring the map here as a focus. And also this is quite a conducive map here, which is the map of the Second Polish Republic, the state which Piłsudski was able to create in the aftermath of the Polish-Soviet War. In that map, the only power that is of any sort of comparable strength to Poland is Romania. And even then, the population of Poland, if I remember correctly, during the interwar period is roughly about 35 million, whereas the population of the greater Romania that you see there is only 20 million. So within that space, with a Soviet Union which is effectively hostile to the rest of the world to varying degrees, and a Germany that has been economically and militarily pacified, in that region between Finland in the north and indeed Greece in the south, Poland could essentially be the closest thing to a regional, even great power. So I very much see this as a project aimed at, you can say, the aggrandizement of Poland in that specific regional sphere. And I think this is sort of an interesting question to bring up, is that I would invest the Poles here in the interwar period with a significant amount of agency. To the same extent, I would say the Poles today have enabled a certain amount of agency which would not be afforded to, say, for example, the Germans. The Poles are allowed to pursue irredentist claims against Russia, but the idea of Germany pursuing any irredentist claims or any attempts to restore lost territory in the Second World War is completely beyond the pale in any sort of political imagination, given that Germany is effectively an occupied country. So there are some similarities, definitely, if we bring in the situation with the Second Polish Republic and the modern day state. And indeed, you can say that this situation is almost directly analogous if we go slightly earlier in the interwar period. If we look at the 1920s, certainly before 1933 and 1935, when the National Socialists come to power and then the National Socialists begin to rearm, because during that time, the French, more so than the British, had contrived a series of alliances which coincided with the intermarium. So just to summarize, the intermarium literally means between the seas. It was a Polish alliance project which envisaged all of these states in the middle, with the exception of Hungary and Austria, the two powers that had been defeated in the First World War, forming an alliance aimed against the Russians and the Poles. The Intermarium was a Polish-centered project, whereas the French design was on a little entente in the east, essentially Czechoslovakia, Romania, Yugoslavia, and to a much lesser extent Poland, that would be aligned with France. And so in this sense, France was using these newly created powers carved out of the ruin of the German, the Russian, and the Austro-Hungarian empires in the First World War as an attempt to create a new French sphere of influence and a dagger aimed at their two major rivals for European supremacy, the Soviet Union and Germany. And I'd like to bring up France here because, of course, France is less relevant today. France was certainly relatively more powerful in the European scheme of things in the 1920s and 1930s than it is today, even though France, I would say, has the most autonomy out of any country within the European Union. I want to bring up France because France is very much related to the story of Poland and the decision effectively to result in its partition, as indeed I would say that the history of Polish partition in 1939 bears very close resemblance to the history of Polish partition in the 18th century. So I suppose I've thrown out a few points, Semigog, and if you want to sort of latch on to any particular sort of historical thread, I can expand upon that if you would like.
Well, one quick thing that occurs to me is obviously it's today very much in Britain's interests as well. Let's not say that in any absolute sense. It does appear that the powers that be in Britain believe it is very much in their interest to pursue a strategy of trying to kick Russia backwards. You know, they've long supported the Poles. The whole business with World War II, you know, and the treaty commitments for defense of Poland, you know, come to mind. So I wonder what role, if any, Great Britain might have played in decisions about partition or to back and support Poland. You know, when that really began.
Yes, absolutely. So, if it's possible, in terms of trying to make sense of this, I think maybe it'll be conducive to talk about the first partition, British and French machinations towards Poland, and then that brings us to the First World War, the interwar period, and then the second partition and the activation of the alliance between the Entente powers, now the Allies, and the Second Polish Republic. Does that sound like a good plan?
Yes, although I do have just a very, very quick question, not to drag this off course, but it seems like the major British French alliance, in order to be able to once again perhaps kick back the Russians, was the Crimean War. At least I'm not aware of anyone that was earlier than that. And of course, that deals with Crimea and the territory of Ukraine today. I don't want to peel it away from this aspect of Poland. But is there a kind of trajectory? Is it possible to interpolate and connect the dots, sort of going forward from the Crimean War to these things we're talking about here?
Absolutely. And I'll be more than happy to expand on that point. And you're right in saying that this really begins with the Crimean War. There were friendly overtures towards Britain from France during the reign of Louis Philippe, but in regarding a tangible policy which is directed at humiliating Russia and pushing back on her borders, yes, it certainly begins in the 1850s, and I'll be very much happy to elaborate on that. But of course, the history of French interests in this region goes back before the British got involved, and I believe it's partly and directly responsible for the first partition, which, like I said, bears close resemblance to the second partition. So, would you like me to start?
Yes, please.
All right. So, going back to this map, so as you can see, Poland in the 17th century was a great power. So all of these questions that we're really discussing today almost don't really bear that much relevance, because the idea that Poland was simply a Trojan horse or an extension of the machinations of other powers. I mean, the closest thing you can say here, Poland was an extension of, was simply the Catholic res publica, the idea of a Catholic Christian commonwealth, because with the 16th and the 17th centuries, a lot of Poland's neighbors, Sweden in the north, Denmark, and Brandenburg and Saxony in the west, even Prussia, which, as you can see here, East Prussia, was technically a vassal state of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And indeed, parts of Livonia and the Courland you can also see here. All of these territories were, to some extent, Protestant, and in that sense, the Polish Lithuanian phenomena was responsible for maintaining a rigid Catholicism in the East, which was very servile to the Pope and the Tridentine reforms that came up in response to Martin Luther. So Poland-Lithuania represents this Catholic great power in opposition to both the Orthodox Muscovites, the Muslim Turks in the south, and the Protestant powers in the Baltic and in Germany. So the natural ally in this situation, of course, is not only the papacy, but also the Habsburg Empire. So in terms, I think, of trying to find an ideological pretext for why Poland should exist, I think the religious angle is the first sort of serious example of that, of why Poland needs to exist, because a weaker Poland means the ascent of the Ottomans, the Russians, the Swedes, and by extension, the Protestants in Germany. And this helps explain why Poland was seen as an international necessity for so long, because of this link to Catholicism and because Poland was on the front line as part of the greater bulwark against Christendom. But after the 17th century, when you have, of course, Jan Sobieski leading the charge of the winged hussars at the siege of Vienna and helping Eugene von Savoy push the boundaries of Christian Europe back to the borders of the Danube and Serbia, the restoration of Hungary, Poland regains territories in the Podolia, which is now in part of Ukraine. Poland-Lithuania enters a period of protracted internal decline. Poland-Lithuania, it should be pointed out, is not a great dynastic state. Poland-Lithuania is surrounded by new centralizing powers, the Austrians, the Muscovites, the Swedes, definitely, and later Brandenburg, which will become Brandenburg, the Kingdom of Prussia. In the context of these various sort of increasingly absolutist states, Poland is a country dominated by a series of magnates, nobles who exist in the Lithuanian part of the empire and the Polish part of the empire. Within Polish historiography, this is called the Golden Liberty or the Polish Liberty. And within the context of this political system, although Poland had a king, he was an elected monarch. Indeed, sometimes foreign powers would agitate to place one of their dynastic members on the throne of Poland. So at one point, a member of the French royal family was a king of Poland, and later he would abandon the throne when he inherited the throne of France. By the beginning of the 18th century, a Saxon, Augustus the Strong von Wettin, becomes the king of Poland-Lithuania by election. But in this case, he is simply a primus inter pares. He is a first among equals. He is responsible for leading Poland's armies, but he has very little power in terms of being able to direct any sort of major domestic reforms, begin the process of centralizing the state in the wake of this situation where Poland-Lithuania is surrounded, and he can't even successfully pass the throne on to his son as well. And all of this creates, I would say, a significant amount of short-termism regarding the thinking of these various Polish monarchs. And it's in that context where you have the partition of Poland. Because Poland is a state dominated by an oligarchy and not by a strong dynast with his own sort of conception of perpetuating Polish power for eternity, like you see with various European dynastic states, it was very easy to buy the magnates and influence the elections in Poland. And as Russia began to became a great power during the 18th century, you have the rise of Peter the Great and then Catherine the Great. Brandenburg, Prussia builds a vast army under King Frederick Wilhelm I. Sweden is a declining power, but Sweden plays a significant role in the history of Poland in the 17th and the 18th century. In the 17th century, Russia and Sweden essentially occupy Poland. the Swedes occupy Poland proper, the Russians occupy most of Lithuania. And this is such a devastating and traumatic moment for Poland and Lithuania that it's actually called the deluge within that history. And you can say a second deluge happens when Poland and Lithuania join sides with the Russians against the Swedes. When the Swedes are ultimately defeated, you have a series of succession wars encompassing Poland. And all Poland is, by the middle of the 18th century, is essentially just an extension of this contrivance of great power politics. Who can sit on the throne of Poland? Which nation can influence policy within Poland? And this is where we really sort of begin to talk about France. But before I go on and directly address the partitions, is there anything you want to bring up?
Well, it's very, very interesting what you say here, that it's propped up with this sort of artificial framework. You know, it's got its struts and supports as necessitated by the interests of the other players in the great power politics. And we're seeing the role, well, we're about to see the role of France. And certainly, latterly, more recently, we've seen the role of Britain in all of this. And of course, it's Britain and France, very much relative to the Crimean War, as a matter of fact, that propped up the Ottoman Empire in a similar way because it suited their interests. So, I mean, in a certain respect, certainly Poles and Lithuanians and the rest who hear this won't like it. But would it be possible to say that in this period it was like another sick man of Europe, like the other sick man of Europe?
In the sense that you had foreign armies marching over with impunity, and you had foreign powers basically determining who your king is. I think you can say it's in some senses far more dramatic than the Ottoman Empire. And I think what's so remarkable about Polish-Lithuanian history in the 18th century is that this is the power that militarily defeated the Ottomans in the Siege of Vienna and helped push back the boundaries of the Ottoman Empire, and accelerate, you can say, the expansion of the Catholic empires in the Balkans. And 100 years later, Poland, Lithuania will cease to exist. I find that completely remarkable. It seems like a tragic, complete about turn in the history of Europe. But that is literally the case. I mean, I've already mentioned the fact that the Swedes were involved in occupying vast swathes of Poland. At the beginning of, obviously, I'm sure you've heard of the Great Northern War, the conflict between Peter the Great and King Charles XII. King Charles XII placed his own puppet king on the throne of Poland and Lithuania. 2 decades after Charles XII died, a member of that same puppet dynasty was placed on the throne at the behest of the French. 20 years after that, you will have a lover of the Russian Empress Catherine the Great being placed on the throne as well. So you can say that Poland, Lithuania only exists as a result, you can say, of the largesse of the various powers that surround it. And increasingly, as you can say, Europe becomes more hedonistic in the 18th century, and it becomes more concerned with realpolitik and the idea of the balance of power. Considerations such as the fact that Poland and Lithuania is a great Catholic empire become a peripheral concern rather than the material and political and military interests of the various powers that surround it. So Austria will go back on this idea of looking at Poland as this great Catholic bulwark, and will instead opt with the various other powers, Russia and Prussia, for territorial annexation. It's interesting, however, to consider that Poland and Lithuania was seen as such a weak power by the 1740s and the 1750s that Prussia doesn't even bother to go to war to join this territory. So as you can see here on the map, unfortunately, I don't have a map which is a little bit later, but nevertheless, this map is useful enough in terms of explaining my point. The area that you see around Königsberg, which in this map is called Kolowek, which is Ducal Prussia, that is East Prussia. That was part of the Kingdom of Prussia, which was formed in 1701. But as you can see, the Polish control Gdansk or Danzig, and they control West Prussia, and they have their access to the sea and the Baltic Sea there. This remained the case throughout most of the reign of even Frederick the Great. Instead, he spent most of his wars not even bothering to fight the Poles, but fighting the French, the Austrians, and this province you can see in the south, Silesia, which, as you can see here, is part of Prussia, where it isn't here, it's part of Austria, and of course the Russians. So consider how weak Poland is, that you have this great war, the 7 Years' War between 756 and 1763, Poland is in the middle of these warring powers, and yet Poland isn't a serious factor in this war. Instead, it's these territorially these smaller states who are having all the effect in terms of the European balance of power. And Prussia emerges from this war. It survives. It is able to part of a contrivance where Russia switches sides in 1762 and Austria is forced to acknowledge the gains of Prussia in that in 1763. Over the course of the next decade, it becomes apparent that Poland-Lithuania cannot exert any independent power of its own, and its fate can simply be determined by fiat, by these various nations you can see that surround it. And this is where I really want to bring in the French, because this is the first time you can say that the French are very much invested in the idea of saving Poland, because as you can see on this map later, Poland does serve a major role for France, which is acting as a strategic buffer against Germany, Prussia, and against the growing power of Russia. And it's very interesting, Semigog, very sort of serendipitously that you brought up the fact that the French were willing to back the Ottoman Empire. The French interest in the Ottoman Empire really begins in the 1750s and 1760s. Around the same time that the French are showing a significant interest in the politics of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So the French aren't just responsible for propping up the Ottomans against the Russians, they're also responsible for propping up the Poles against the Russians. And you can see, obviously, that would logically follow, given the fact that they are being used essentially to execute the same policy, which is to prevent the resurgence of Austrian and Russian power, in particular Austrian power, because Austria was the principal antagonist towards France during this period. And in that sense, having a strong Poland and having a strong Ottoman Empire, regardless of their religious affiliation, I think it's almost incidental the fact that France is a Catholic nation and Poland is a Catholic nation. It's important to understand why Poland has now become an international diplomatic necessity, even though Poland, as I've tried to demonstrate throughout the 18th century, cannot exert any sort of independent foreign policy to the point that its kings have been determined from outside. And you can say the most obvious example of what I'm trying to illustrate is the War of the Bar Confederation, which was a last-ditch attempt of a series of nobles, not the king. The king, like I said, was a former lover of the Empress of Russia, Catherine the Great. A number of nobles with French support who wanted to reform and centralize the Polish-Lithuanian monarchy to be able to counteract these foreign powers. And it has the opposite effect. Rather than allowing a coalition to coalesce which would reform the monarchy and perhaps compel the king to either be a patriot or indeed foster onto Poland-Lithuania a new king, or maybe even empower that king to exert the same amount of authority as the Austrian emperor or the king of Prussia. Instead, the various powers use this as a pretext to get involved in the direct political situation of Poland-Lithuania and contrive its partition. What I actually find rather baffling about this, and I bring this up, Semigog, because it's almost exactly what we have with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the Nazi-Soviet Pact. In my estimation, having studied this topic, the Russians, in both cases, in both the original partition of Poland and the second partition of Poland, they are the dupes of the Prussians. The Prussians and the Germans. The Prussians want to annex the wealthiest parts of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to create one single continuous state that you see in this map here. And it just so happens that their territory is divided by Poland, as indeed their territory will be divided by Poland again during the interwar period. As a result of this, Russia was promised these vast territories in the east, but they also happened to be the most economically bankrupt territories within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So Prussia was able essentially to control the Polish economy. It was able to control Poland's access to the sea. It was able to control the main waterway through Poland, Lithuania, which of course is the River Vistula, whereas Russia gained these vast bogs and plains in western Ukraine and in Belarusia, in a similar sense of what you can say with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, in which the Soviet Union gains very similar territories. And what is also important to understand is that during the situation, it wasn't a case, as I said, that Poland and Lithuania could seriously exert any independent foreign policy. And so the logic for the Russians, I think, would have been much sounder, far more sound, had the Russians decided to stand by their puppet king and back the creation, you can say, the territorial integrity of Poland and Lithuania, and allow Poland to remain a puppet. Because in that sense, Russia would gain a vast buffer region between its two major rivals, Austria and Prussia, and it would prevent Austria and Prussia gaining vast concessions and economic and material benefits from the partition. Because even though Russia gains by far the most territory, it is the least economically valuable territory in the grand scheme of things. All it does is give Russia more strategic depth, as it were, but at the cost of losing this buffer state. And of course, when we look at the history of the Warsaw Pact, Stalin's thinking was very much predicated on creating these buffer zones between Germany and, by extension, NATO and the West. So all of these factors that we see now, especially for Russia and its desire to create a zone of at least neutral powers, Ukraine supposedly being one up until 2014, which was separate it from NATO and allow the Russian Federation to maintain an aspect of security. I think all of these questions really begin with the first partition of Poland in 1772. And I will say that for Russia, this ultimately proved to be a disastrous decision because all it did ultimately was serve to economically benefit Prussia and Austria, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. And you bring up another point which should have occurred to me in the first place, for all that I, blather about, Ukraine meaning the borderland. Um, I mean, certainly everybody jokes about how, except the Poles maybe, that the Poland in large part lies on that trans-European plane, which is sort of like the 12-lane expressway in both directions for marching armies. So naturally, it's sort of the country that doesn't have any major geographic features that give it security, and it's just easy for horse-borne hordes or mechanized infantry to just flood one way and another across it. And given that background, it now seems obvious to me that it's not enough to point out that Ukraine is itself, that the name means borderland. I think it extends to this entire region. Everything that you're talking about suggests that, in that specific meaning, the entire, all of this area should be called the Ukraine, because it is effectively a place that the competing powers want to carve up, and they want to have the various perforated lines running in such fashion that, based on expediency and their diplomatic needs at any given time, they can adjust or modify how it's carved up to suit the balance of power of the surrounding nations. So Germany, Russia, Austro-Hungarian Empire, that sort of thing. And it occurs to me also that you talk about how they didn't end up with really one proper, powerful, absolute monarch. Instead, what they have is oligarchs who sort of install a a puppet ruler of one kind or another, or something similar. And of course, all of this is following the great days of the Sun King and the really proper introduction of absolute monarchs in the West. So Ukraine and the leaders and thinkers there must have seen that happen. It's not like nobody in Poland heard of Louis the 14th. So it occurs to me that this aspect of it being a borderland is, in some respects, its doom. And I wonder if we might be heading for that today as well. But that's anticipating things a bit much. I know you still need to cover France.
No, there's several points which I want to sort of stem from that. I mean, obviously the French were aware of the example of the Bourbon monarchy and Louis XIV, but they took the wrong lessons. They took the wrong lessons from Louis XIV. Augustus the Strong of Saxony decided to build vast monuments and sire dozens of bastards. So in all the superficial aspects, he was able to he tried to match the sexual virility and the artistic patronage of Louis XIV, but in the same sense of actually commanding victorious armies in the field and creating a stable state with a vast army. The predecessor to the Levy en Masse, a complete and absolute failure, who was chased from his throne by a Swedish puppet. But regarding this question about Poland having no natural borders, I think this is a very pertinent point, because this map that you see of Poland, indeed, this map that you see of Poland, this map that you see of Poland, and the first Poland, I mean, the first Poland bears more resemblance with modern Poland than any of the intermediary Polands. Poland and its political geography have been constantly changing. You have these vague regions of the Wielkopolska, Malopolska, Mazovia, and then, of course, in the earlier Poland iteration, you have Silesia and you have Pomerania, which were part of Poland, and the River Oder being the natural border in the west. And of course, the interesting thing is that the modern Polish border follows that same ancient trajectory, which was established in the 11th century. But of course, Poland has no natural border in the east. And as we see, this border on the west, the Oder River, is a temporary border. And indeed, it was a contrivance very much of Soviet and Allied policymaking, which restored the Oder border as the modern border of a new Polish nation state. So this idea of Poland, Lithuania representing some sort of continuous borderland is very relevant. Of course, Ukraine has a specific etymology, and if I'm going to be really pedantic, it is the region to the south of Kiev around Pereyaslav, where you get to the wild fields and Zaporizhia, etc., which represents the true Ukraine, because that separated the Rus principalities from the Kipchaks. But apart from that, the whole sort of basis of this region, from Belarus to Lithuania to the idea of a Ukrainian nation state, which doesn't exist at that point. We're still talking about Catholic Rus and Orthodox Rus, primarily distinguished by religion and their allegiance to the King of Poland or the Grand Duke of Lithuania. Indeed, it's because of the lack of any geographic features other than, you can say, the River Dnieper. I would say the River Dnieper was the closest thing you have to a consistent border on the east. And indeed, if you look at this map, the River Dnieper does end up forming some form of natural boundary in the east. But of course, that was a rather artificial boundary. It wasn't determined by a long sort of continuity of history. And as you can see on this map, only 100 years earlier than that, Poland and Lithuania invariably expanded way beyond the Dnieper, even towards the outskirts of Moscow. Indeed, in terms of looking at Poland and Lithuania as this not only a Promethean state, but as a state which is specifically hostile or orienting against Russia. Don't forget that in 1613, the Polish-Lithuanian armies also occupied Moscow, and it was the liberation of Moscow which ushered in the creation of the Romanov dynasty in Russia. So all of this is relevant regarding the eternal flux regarding its borders. I mean, the only reason why Poland and Lithuania has these borders that you can see now is because the Mongols invade in the 13th century. The Mongols decimate the Rus principalities. The Rus in the west fail to coalesce into a new state around Haliach, which would have been in western Ukraine today. And instead, they are conquered by a new rising Catholic power, that is Lithuania, who basically just walk into Kiev and are able to carve out a major semi-nomadic empire in the east. And through dynastic policy and aiming at the Germans, the Polish and the Lithuanian Commonwealth is formed through the course of the 15th and the 16th century. But as you say, this is a marriage of convenience. You have formed this new great power, this sort of Frankenstein's monster of a border situation. You can say that Poland and Lithuania has some borders in the west regarding the sort of the Carpathian mountain ranges, and if you extend it to the sea, the Baltic Sea in the north, but it doesn't even reach the Black Sea in the south. Poland and Lithuania was never able to gain a decisive footing in the Black Sea. So all of your points, I think, are very relevant and worthwhile to consider. But bringing back to my point about British and French machinations, because they come up repeatedly in Poland's history, France is basically kept out of this. Indeed, as the process of the partitions accelerates, you have the first partition, as you can see on this map, in 1772, and then two partitions in quick succession when there was a last-ditch attempt at reforming Poland between 1793 and 1795. Why don't the French do anything to stop this? Well, obviously, you know, Semigog. In 1789, they have a revolution, and in the same year as the second partition of Poland, the king is executed via guillotine. So France is really in no position to determine the fate of Poland and Lithuania during this time. When does France become powerful enough to be able to exert and essentially impose a new Polish policy in the East? Well, of course, it is with the advent of Napoleon. When Napoleon comes along and he defeats Prussia decisively in 1806 and 1807 in the War of the Fourth Coalition, what does Napoleon do? You can see on this map here that in the final partition of Poland, Warsaw and Poznan were given over to Prussia. Well, out of Warsaw and Poznan, Napoleon carves out a new state from this, a resurrected Polish state, which is called the Duchy of Warsaw. 2 years later, he defeats the Austrians in the War of the Fifth Coalition. And you see this light green area around Lublin. That is annexed into the Duchy of Warsaw. And indeed, there was an attempt from Napoleon to characterize the 1812 Patriotic War, the famous Napoleonic invasion of Russia, as the war, essentially, of Polish-Lithuanian restoration. The idea that the Poles on side during this conflict would restore these vast territories you can see which have been gobbled up by Russia as a result of the partitions. So Polish irredentism, Polish restoration of these lost territories is an essential component of Napoleonic and French revolutionary strategy from 1807 up until 1813.
Yes, very, very interesting indeed. So we can see the historical background of the French and their interest in this. They certainly like to, maneuver to bring other states in and bring pressure to bear. I mean, there's I'm sure you have it right at hand in your mind, so to speak. Who was the French king who was perfectly happy to have Ottoman ships drop into his ports on the Mediterranean?
Francis I.
Yeah, so the French have been willing to reach out very far to the east to bring pressure to bear on things closer to home for them. The Brits, it seems that they come into this a little bit later. No, I mean I do
Of
recall
course,
that.
of course, you have to understand that the Brits would in no way be supporting Napoleon now with his Polish project, but certainly
Certainly,
later, yeah.
certainly. But I do recall that there was wasn't there a Polish king or emperor who actually had tried to take the hand of Elizabeth once upon a time?
Yes, that story is Tsar Ivan the Terrible of Russia, Muscovy, and he pursued a marriage policy at, I believe it was Elizabeth, her lady in waiting, rather than Elizabeth herself. But yes, that is an apocryphal story regarding Ivan the Terrible. But
Well, I think
as
there
far
was one. I think there was one about a Pole, but I am not certain, and I certainly wouldn't argue with you about
no,
it.
no,
So
it would have been very unlikely because, of course, Poland and Lithuania was Catholic at that time. But
well, yeah,
yeah.
you have a point there. But what I guess the heart of it is then, at what point did Britain really begin to stick its finger into this borderland pie? Its
I'll
perfidious fingers.
be absolutely willing to talk about that. All right. So Napoleon is obviously defeated in 1814 and again in 1815. Now, the Russians are somewhat scarred by this memory of Napoleon restoring a small Polish state and using it as a vehicle to essentially expand by proxy into the Russian Empire. And so, as a consequence, the Tsar, then Alexander I, believes that Russia has won the right to control Poland indefinitely. And the policy he's thwarted by the Austrians, the French, and the Prussians in this situation. But Alexander I's policy here is to restore all of Poland's original territory. So this vast map you see in the west, which, as you can see, Prussia and Austria have taken over these significant territories in the west. Galicia for the Austrians, Galicia, Lodomeria, and of course West Prussia, annexed to Prussia. Alexander I wants these territories amalgamated to a restored Kingdom of Poland, of which he is the king. So here, Alexander I is using Polish policy to gain territories at the expense of his continental rivals, Austria and Prussia. Indeed, Alexander, during the course of the Congress of Vienna from 1814 until 1815, is seen as the greatest threat to European peace. And what is more, in terms of bringing France back into this, and to a lesser extent Britain, France is brought into the negotiations regarding the Congress of Vienna, represented by Maurice de Talleyrand. And France, actually, despite being a defeated power, bears some political and military bearing on the situation, because Talleyrand very adeptly realizes that all of a sudden France has become very quickly a political necessity, a counterweight to Russia expanding, using the threat of uniting all of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth under the Russian aegis. So instead, the Tsar has to be satisfied with this much smaller Poland you see here, with these tiny little sort of frayed borders in the east, which becomes Congress Poland. And the British collaboration here is this idea that all of these new states would have to be given constitutions, and they would have to be given charters with a limited set of liberties. So, for example, freedom of the press. And the idea essentially would be that Alexander I would acquiesce to being a constitutional monarch over Poland. And because of Alexander I's strange relationship with constitutional reforms, the Russian Revolution, and the fact that he would flip-flop so many times from seemingly contradictory positions. Even there was a policy, it should be envisaged under Alexander I, whereby the Russian state would use Freemasonry as a tool in terms of recruiting bureaucrats into the empire. So Alexander I was renowned for his seemingly bizarre and self-defeating policies, but he agreed with the British that there should be a liberal constitutional settlement in Congress Poland. And what happens over the course of the next few decades is that the situation falls apart very quickly. The whole Polish situation, now that Alexander I is dead in 1825, is supported by the three powers. They all have significant Polish populations: Prussia, Austria, and Russia. So it is in the interest of all these powers to prevent the Poles from uniting and forming an independent bloc effectively. And this is where the British come in. I'm not going to get into the causes of the Crimean War, but suffice to say, Semigog, it's interesting that the fate of Poland and the fate of the Ottoman Empire are entwined, as they are in the 1770s with the Bar Confederation and the French supporting the Ottomans against the Russians during the War of 1768 up until 1774. That is a very important point, because the Russians try and exert a dominant influence over the European Ottoman Empire, and to bear weight on the European situation, they occupy the Danubian Principalities, which is modern-day Romania. This precipitates Austria defecting from their alliance with Russia, and it precipitates also the French and the British getting involved in the Crimean War to give Russia a bloody nose, because this time France wants to use that, you can say, ancient link all the way back to Francis I and the capitulations and these various treaties that have arisen from France backing the Ottoman Empire, that it should be France that has the dominant interest in the Ottoman Empire, supported by the British rather than the Russians. So here you can say that Napoleon III, who is now the Emperor of the French, is resurrecting the old French policy of the 1760s and the 1770s. However, unlike King Louis XV and later King Louis XVI, Napoleon III is able to back it with force and with the support of Britain, whose interests in the Mediterranean are also under threat. So this is where we get the first British and French collaboration with the Crimean War, but this also pays off with Poland as well, because in 1863, there is a massive revolt in Poland, not just in Poland, but in all of these territories you can see here, which were part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. There was an entire movement of the former Catholic Polish-Lithuanian elite and various intellectual circles, revolutionary societies, etc., who were supportive of the idea of restoring the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And who was backing this revolution in these territories? It was, of course, the French and the British. So in terms of this connection between using the Ottomans as a tool against the Russians, but also using the Poles as a tool against the Russians, this goes back to French policy in the 1760s. It's restored with Napoleon again in between 1806 to 1812 and 1813, and Napoleon III resurrects this policy. However, if people are interested, I do have a lecture on this,
You just did one on Napoleon III, did you
which
not?
which I talked about Napoleon III. And the irony of all of this is that here, France is trying to use Poland as essentially a means of weakening the Russian Empire. All this does, because the Polish-Lithuanian revolt ends in disaster. The Poles are crushed. All the residual rights associated with this constitutional settlement in Congress Poland are erased. And in addition, the Tsar begins to repress the language rights of the various other groups as well, such as the Ukrainian dialect. And later, there is even an attempt to Russify the Baltic states as well under Tsar Alexander III. So this goes very badly for all the nations which are involved in the idea of prometheanism, and it goes especially badly for France, because what state supports Russia in the situation? Prussia. And essentially, as a result of this, as a result of the French trying to contrive a new Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to weaken Russia, all they've done is driven the Russians into the hands of the Prussians, which means the Prussians have now complete carte blanche to unify Germany and attack France without any major continental allies. So my contention is always that the French trying to resurrect Poland was responsible for the unification of Germany.
And this brings Germany onto our map, quite literally, as a unified nation, as one of the players in this drama. Does it not?
Yes, absolutely. But I think what I'm trying to bring up here is that Russia and Prussia, as we've seen, Russia and Germany, have had a vested interest in the dissolution of Poland and keeping that situation going, essentially. In both cases, with the partition of Poland you see here, French interests were undermined, and the Russians and the Prussians were able to gain something, albeit I believe the Prussians did much better out of the situation than the Russians. In this scenario, again, you can say the Russians have essentially been duped into allowing Germany to become far more powerful and unite under the auspices of Bismarck. And indeed, you can see that the fate of France is to some extent entwined with the fate of Poland. As Poland becomes weaker, Russia and Prussia and later Germany becomes stronger, and as a result, France becomes diplomatically isolated. So, in terms of finding continuity here, I mean, there is so much, as you can see, going back to these examples even before we get to the Central Powers' victory in the First World War. But of course, this all changes because there's something very bizarre in the history of Europe and indeed the history of the world, which happens 20 years later, which is that the French and the Russians form an alliance. And from the Russian point of view, this is something I've always tried to understand, because, again, from the Russian point of view, allying with a nation which is so hostile towards Germany, which would in turn mean that you, by extension, become hostile towards Germany as well, Russia I'm talking about, seems rather counterintuitive and counterproductive. And I believe that as a result of this, Russia essentially was involved in a Faustian pact which brought it into the First World War with French agitation backing, which almost reverses this entire scenario, which I've mentioned, which makes it all the more confusing. Because in the First World War, it is not French and British machinations, contrivance, which brings Poland and Lithuania back to life. It is German and Austrian contrivance which brings Poland back to life, and only because they are at war with Russia, and they want to carve out a new Polish state to act as a potential buffer against Russia in any future war. So you can almost say that the situation with the Central Powers in World War One is the only example in the history of the last sort of 250 years where the trend is really bucked, and the Germans are the ones pushing for Poland which exclusively acts in this case as a way to extend German power eastwards. Whereas as of now, you can say the Germans and the Russians have been happy collaborators, and the French have been the ones trying to undermine and unsettle that situation, if that makes sense. But it's very strange in the grand scheme of things to have Prussia and the Austrians supporting the Polish independence movement as they do during the First World War.
Yes. And again, when you say buffer, I can just hear border, and that whole idea of borderlands gets extended. It's just, it's a almost absurd oversimplification, but, in large part, I navigate with such simplifications necessarily because, as soon as you dig under the surface, everything becomes much more complex. But the idea of the entire area being really a borderland, not just that southern part of Ukraine, is useful to me. But anyway, we already covered that. The business here of the appearance, well, first first Prussia, and then the proper appearance of Germany, and the way in which we again and again see cooperation up until the middle of the last century, Russian and German cooperation. I'm sure there are examples of them being at loggerheads that I don't know about, but it does, the appearance of Germany on the map and the nature of the relationship between Russia and Germany. This kind of brings us around to the idea of Prometheanism proper, and the geopolitical situation that Piłsudski was facing. And it also, raises questions about the motivations on the part of the powers that be today for placing this buffer, this borderland region of Slavic states. Well, let's not say placing it. Let's say activating it as a buffer and pouring investment into it in terms of logistics and in terms of money, military investment, and the rest. We're seeing a return of a borderland, except that this time it runs from the Baltic states all the way down through Romania. Certainly Moldova, they're trying to bring online with it now, and they're, with any luck, they certainly at least want to try to make Bulgaria a part of it. Although they're having less luck with that. We'll see how all that goes. So we're seeing the return of a borderland, and it seems to be playing this twofold function that historically Poland did, where it's pointed in one sense westward towards Germany, and at the same time eastward towards Russia. And certainly in today's circumstances, we can see that, very, very explicit evidence that the whole goal is to inflate the importance and strength of Poland at the expense of Germany. I mean, you'll see articles about it now, about how Germany's going to have to get a lot of its natural resources from Poland. The U.S. military is moving its bases to Poland, whereas, historically its big spot had been Germany for that sort of thing. And you've got Poland not only doing everything it can to back Ukraine against Russia, it's also got a hammer it's got the threat of something that it likes to hold over the head of Germany beyond all the things where it's chiseling its way into Germany's economy and the rest, of going after them for World War II reparations. So we're seeing, I guess, this. Perhaps I'm doing this too early, or if I've cut you off from other important points you want to cover, certainly go back to them. But it does seem as though we're seeing this buffer on the map, and it's a band primarily of Slavic countries, although it includes Romania, a Latin drop in a Slavic sea, as they like to say, as well as the Baltic states. So it's not certainly all Slavic. Slavic, pardon me, and they're bringing Finland into NATO now as well. So they basically they're putting together a new curtain, a new iron curtain, I guess, but it's a buffer of some kind, and it does not simply block Central and Western Europe or divide it from Russia and vice versa. It also seems to be designed to absorb and replace some of the industrial capacity and certainly the military capacity that formerly was present further west.
I think regarding the specific military installations you see, obviously we can look to the Duchy of Warsaw and Napoleonic dependency on Polish cavalry and utilizing a resurrected Polish state to weaken Prussia, yet at the same time weaken Russia. So I think in terms of a direct historical parallel, you can see it in the Napoleonic Wars. However, the situation regarding 1916 onwards is really rather tragic, but what you're essentially describing, even down to the framework of the geography that you're seeing in the current conflict in the East, it originates here with Prometheanism and the destruction of the Russian Empire and the birth of the Soviet Union. But I need to emphasize that it's not really as a result of Germany or even Austrian designs, because as I've tried to point out, Germany and Austria have actually got on pretty well with Russia. I mean, even in the situation that you see here, the idea that the Habsburgs and the Prussians would ever seriously be threatened by Russia at all isn't even a serious consideration until the 18th century. Before then, Muscovy had simply always been a peripheral power, to the point that Poland and Lithuania was always considered the more powerful of the two. It's only in the 18th century with the partitions that Russia becomes noteworthy as a major power. And of course, the French Revolution, you can say, and the threats of European revolution in general force these three powers together. However, in the First World War, I believe, in complete sort of contrariness to Russia's long-term strategic and political aims, these two powers, which are in some way ideologically aligned against the West, find themselves in a war against each other. Even when we look at the restoration of a Polish state in 1916, it is done very begrudgingly by the Russians, and only after there had been several attempts to try and force the Tsar to make a separate peace. Only after these separate peace ventures fail and fail repeatedly do the Germans acquiesce to the creation of a Polish state, which they occupy now out of some sort of necessity. And a few months later, of course, Tsar Nicholas II is deposed. You have a provisional government, and you can say that Prometheanism therefore occupies a strange position in that the central powers are pushing this policy because as a necessity, because they find themselves now at war with a former ally in the sense of Russia having been an ally with Austria and Germany with the Holy Alliance and the Dreikaiserbund. So for much of the 19th century, all of this diplomatic status quo has now been upended and changed. But Prometheanism and the disintegration of the Russian Empire is now coming from within the Russian Empire itself, beyond the territories that have been occupied by Germany. So just to put this in perspective, Germany has occupied Poland proper, and it has occupied Lithuania and part of Latvia. But in the rest of Russia, in Finland especially, the coalition of social democrats that have come to power by June of 1917, they're essentially socialists, but they're all nationalists of a particular type. So it is a coalition of the Baltic states, of the Ukrainians, and of the Finns supporting a very weak government in Petrograd, St. Petersburg. And when the October Revolution breaks out, these coalitions of aligned socialist states or socialist movements in these various national blocs within the Russian Empire declare their independence. And of course, most of these governments find themselves dominated by Germany. In 1918, there was the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which forces Russia out of the war. And in terms of understanding this, bring us to this map here, which is the modern day map. This, just for reference, the red brown is the Commonwealth of Independent Nations, and the dark blue is the European Union, just to have some sort of modern perspective. But the borders are roughly analogous to what you see with in the East, not the West, obviously, with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. There was a desire to create a independent Finland, a independent Lithuania, states carved out of the Baltic states, albeit they would probably be one country, Livonia or the Baltic Union. Of course, the first creation of an independent Ukraine, and creation of states in the Caucasus as well, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and perhaps added to these states also, you would have various Cossack republics in the Kuban and in the Don and the upper and the lower Volga regions. So this is all as a result of the collapse of the Russian Empire. And Germany is very much sustained by that same thinking regarding essentially pushing the boundaries of an alliance system against Russia. And again, this is motivated by ideology. As you can say, it is as much motivated by ideology as it is today, because we're talking about a conservative, militaristic, monarchical Europe opposing a radical Bolshevik socialist revolutionary movement, which has now taken power in Central European Russia, emanating around Moscow. So Germany has every interest in propping up these new states in the East to act as a buffer, but also, similar reasons today, to act as a resource base for any potential future conflict with either the Bolshevik Soviet Union or indeed with the Western powers. And this is why Ukraine becomes pivotal in terms of this understanding, because Ukraine can provide the Central Powers with the needed raw materials and most notably food to stave off any potential blockade from the West. And of course, you can say that the British blockade of Germany is roughly analogous to the sanctions that have been imposed in Russia today. So Ukraine, as it is today, back in 1917 and 1918, is essential in terms of understanding this picture. But how does Poland come into this situation? Ukrainian nationalism, in my view, only really becomes in terms of even utilizing the name Ukraine, it only becomes a decisive political project in the 1890s, and it doesn't emerge within Russia proper. All of the Ukrainian intellectuals have gone into exile as a result of the Ems Ukaz if I remember correctly, it was 1874, around that time, by Alexander II. They have taken up residence in Lemberg in East Galicia, which is now Lvov, Lviv. And what Ukrainian nationalism provides the Austrians is essentially it's a way of detaching the Ruthenian population in Austria-Hungary from any sympathy, loyalty to Russia, but it's also a counterweight to the Poles in that region. The Austrians are playing off a budding Ukrainian nationalism against the Poles, and both of these states are hostile to Russia. So what you see in the modern day political situation, where you have a alliance against Russia, but also two nation states which have been pitted against each other within the same state, it should be added, in Austria-Hungary. It begins with Austria-Hungary in the 1890s, and with the victory over the Central Powers in World War One, all we see is this situation writ large. You don't see the recreation of a Polish-Lithuanian state as you see here, or could have been a viable solution in 1863 had the revolution actually succeeded. And of course it didn't, it was crushed. Instead here, you have new nationalities being carved out of the East, and we see the creation of a first independent Ukrainian state. And in the spirit of the borderland semiagog, its borders are essentially its borders are congruent with the European military situation. So the more powerful Germany and the Central Powers become, the larger Ukraine will be. And ideally, I mean, I don't have a map here because this is Polish centered stream and not a Ukraine centered stream. But the borders of Ukraine could have pushed further into the east, up the River Don, encompassing the region around Kursk, which again is a major food producing region, indeed expanding up, possibly even threatening Moscow itself. So all of these ideas about bringing Ukraine and bringing Poland into a European coalition with that friction there, which keeps them from uniting and becoming a great power in their own right, as you see with Poland and Lithuania, and thereby in some way dependent on foreign backing. It has its origins in the collapse of the Russian Empire and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. But of course, even though the situation, you can say, plays out very similarly to how our current sort of international situation in the East, all of this is upset by the fact that the Central Powers, of course, lose World War One. Germany is militarily defeated. Austria is dissolved as an empire and divided into many sort of requisite nations. And the Soviets begin reasserting their dominance in the region and are able to reconquer parts of the Russian Empire. They're able to restore their power in Central Asia, in the Caucasus, and in most of Ukraine. And this is the situation where you have Prometheanism, because like I said, Prometheanism is supported by the Germans and the Austrians, but it's already an existent movement among various democratic socialists within the Russian Empire. Now Poland, which was created by Germany and Austria-Hungary in 1916, restored from their occupied territories, it has now become a power in its own right, and it is directed against Germany with the support of the French and against the Soviet Union, which again with the support of the French. And thereby Poland becomes a international necessity, but for different reasons than we saw only a few years earlier when Poland was aligned with the Central Powers as opposed to being aligned with the Entente Powers. I know this may sound very convoluted and somewhat contradictory, but it's important to understand because of how fluid the diplomatic situation was during the First World War and its immediate aftermath. Of course, the Polish go to war with the Soviet Union. Trotsky gets as far as the Vistula, but of course the Polish under Pilsudski are successful, and they're able to create this rather bizarre border that you see here. And I really do mean bizarre. There is no ethnic justification for establishing a Polish state here. And this is why I think an understanding of Prometheanism and the diplomatic international situation is essential in understanding the maintenance of the Second Polish Republic, because what you see here is almost less a Polish nation state than the recreation of a Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In this map, we have no Ukraine. Indeed, Western Ukraine has been absorbed into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Parts of Lithuania also have been absorbed into this new Second Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, including Vilna, Vilnius, the old capital of Lithuania. Instead, the interwar capital of Lithuania is at Kaunas. And you also have Belarusia as well, which has been partly annexed. This is an ethnic map of interwar Poland, the Second Polish Republic. And of course, there is a significant German population. Danzig isn't given to Poland outright, but Danzig is created as an international free city. But essentially, its external, its foreign policy is determined by Poland. And Poland begins establishing its corridor, linking it to the Baltic Sea. So what we see in 1918 through to 1921, with the defeat of the Soviets in the East, with French and Entente American backing as well, with the 14 points, and British backing, and the defeat of Germany, is that we see roughly a restoration of this scenario here, where Poland is a major factor to be considered in the political maintenance of Eastern Europe. And it is continued French support and this understanding essentially that Poland has become a diplomatic necessity to be directed at Germany and to be directed at the Soviet Union for the maintenance of France and by extension its ally Great Britain. And compounding this also in a way that almost wasn't the case. You can almost say that there's an argument to be made that Poland here is more powerful than Poland in the late 17th century and the early 18th century, because Poland doesn't have a strong rival to the north and it doesn't have a strong rival to the south. There is no Sweden and there is no Austrian Empire. So all of these little countries that have been formed in the wake of the dissolution of Austria-Hungary and the Russian Empire, the Baltic states, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, all of these states in some way become dependent on Poland and by extension France. So what you're seeing here is the creation, the potential creation, had it actually sort of gone further, of a true intermarium, where Poland is being able to carve out its own regional sphere of influence in the East. And of course, bearing this with the modern situation here, Poland, you can say, arguably is beginning more or less to fill that role again, in the situation with Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia, and with Germany essentially again being militarily less relevant than it was during the height of the Cold War, and Poland being that new source essentially of that, having that political utility which it did not possess because, of course, during the Cold War it was part of the Warsaw Pact. But I think that's my sort of not brief, obviously, but that's my summary of trying to understand Poland and its significance as a result of the early situation in the interwar period, coming out of Polish resurrection in the First World War, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does, and very nicely set forth. I continue to be amazed. Yes, very, very, very nicely done, and thank you. There's a particular aspect that I'm curious about in terms of what you referred to as sort of the first set of reasons that brought these borders about with Germany. Um, and Austria being interested in it, and then a sort of it got flipped from being a glass half empty to a glass half full somehow. You know, the position on the map remained more or less the same, but the powers and interests that it subsequently suited seemed to flip as you were talking about that. Or I'm sorry, seemed to flip as you were previously discussing. And I want to come back to that definitely. So, but maybe let's stick a flag in it. But beforehand, since I have a proper um, uh, historian on, um, what do you make of the whole way in which Poland was dealt with at the outset of World War One? Because it does seem, excuse me, pardon me, at the outset of World War Two, because it does seem that basically Germany and Russia. And these are two parties that it would seem, you know, powers further west had wished to afflict with Poland to, you know, to stick it like a burr in their sock, you know. So there are certain things that they couldn't do. Both those powers just turned around and said, "Yeah, you know what? Fuck Poland." It's like, you know, Mustache Man and Stalin got on the phone with each other, so to speak, right? I'm ridiculously oversimplifying, but they said, you know what, this country is a real problem for both of us. Let's just split it between us. And then
Well,
they proceeded to do so. No?
you're essentially correct, and I'm not even joking in terms of the way in which it was contrived. Of course, they went through the course of doing it through intermediaries. Of course, the German foreign minister was von Ribbentrop and Molotov, but you know, Stalin was gleeful and he was actively involved in carving out these spheres of influence in Poland. And in terms of getting us to that situation, because it is, like I said, very similar to what we have with the first partition, where Catherine the Great, Mary Theresa of Austria, and Frederick the Great of Prussia are gleefully divvying up Poland progressively from the 1770s until the 1790s, annexing these territories and ultimately focusing on the threat from France, almost as if history is repeating itself here. Of course, the Germans ultimately invade the Soviet Union, so there is, of course, a historical breach in terms of that continuity, but that's neither here or there. But just regarding the run-up to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, from 1921 until 1935, Pilsudski was actually, if I remember correctly, he was only the president or really sort of directly in charge of Poland through some of the 1920s. I think he
Right.
was.
He had people he supported and sort of put forth, right? So he could be behind the scenes and not take it full in the chin.
Yes, exactly. He there was what was it? The Senation political movement around Pilsudski, which was basically a, you can say, a military-led movement. Of course, Pilsudski was a field marshal and a general, effectively, which had a left-wing faction, a more socialist inclined faction, a more right faction, which sympathized with elements of the Polish Falange, the phalanx, and of course you have the Falangist movement in Spain at this time, which was sort of more diehard Polish nationalists. But nevertheless, it was built around this coalition supported by the strongman Pilsudski, who wielded power and influence indirectly. And he dies in 1935, and this weakens the internal predicament of Poland. To make matters worse, France is progressively falling apart through the course of the 1930s. There had been quite a strong, ironically, France was in a way stronger without Alsace-Lorraine, because it was one factor which united the left and the right in France, which was the hatred of Germany and the desire to see France's the metropole, continental France, restored to the original Pentagon, as you can see here on the on the Western map here. Whereas once the French were victorious, that unifying factor of the restoration of the metropole suddenly goes away. Now it's about the maintenance of a new European order and keeping guard against the Soviet Union and the Hungarians, the Austrians to a much lesser extent, but obviously Germany, from upsetting these plans. And with the Locarno Pact in the 1920s, it really does seem that the French have won this diplomatic situation. But with the Great Depression and with the political instability in France, the failure of any sort of far-sightedness and political will to uphold this new alliance system that had been created in the East, the fluctuations between the Radical Party and the rightists in France, those who were cynical, skeptical towards this collaboration with these various alliances, and those who were looking, say, for example, to a new set of alliances, say, for example, looking to Italy as a more reliable ally than looking to places like Romania, Poland, Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia. Because France lacked a consistent policy throughout the 1930s, Germany was basically able to determine the reordering of Europe through the course of 1936 up until 1939. And you can say that it's no sort of wonder, really, why the Soviets and the Germans were able to get away with the dissolution of Poland, because France and Britain had already sort of tacitly accepted the arguments put forward by the Soviets and the Germans that the situation that was being created in the East was an artificial settlement. So just to very briefly summarize this, obviously Yugoslavia was an extension of the pre-war Kingdom of Serbia, and this caused major issues regarding the relationship between the Catholic Croatians and the Serbs. Hungary, with the Treaty of Trianon, was Hungary was the most humiliated party out of all of the Central Powers, not Germany, Hungary by far. Hungary lost 60% of its territory and 40% of ethnic Hungarians in order to create these new states, which had virtually no historical continuity, such as the Greater Romania you see here, and the new state of Czechoslovakia, which in terms of a historical precedent, you have to look to Greater Moravia in the 7th century in order to find a set of borders which coincides with this new territory.
Rather some distance back, yes.
Yes, some distance back. And the same could be said with Poland and Lithuania. Poland, just the Second Polish Republic. The only reason why Poland has these borders stretching into the east was because of the military victory of Poland in the Second Polish War. It suited everyone further west to have a Poland that was as eastwards as possible. And as a consequence, as you can see here, just like the other diplomatic contrivances as a result of the Entente victory in World War One, Poland already had a significant Belarusian, Lithuanian, German, and Ruthenian Ukrainian population. And that also means that the Soviets have a direct claim on these territories, because in response to Prometheanism, I mean, we've been talking about Prometheanism as if the Poles and the various nationalities had a monopoly over this, but the Soviets had their own counter policy to this, which was kolonizacja, the idea of indigenization, literally laying down roots of creating nationalities and envisaging of the Soviet Union as a generally cosmopolitan internationalist state. This is reversed somewhat when Stalin fully begins to ascend in the Soviet Union during the great purges of 1937 and 1938. But up until that point, Ukrainian nationalism was used as a counterweight against Poland, as with Belarusian nationalism. And indeed, Ukrainian nationalism was an attempt also at regaining Bessarabia, which was then part of Greater Romania, because a significant Ukrainian population lived in Bessarabia and lived in the Bukovina. So the Soviets are also attempting to agitate for their various sort of patron nationalities within the Second Polish Republic, and so it's something that works both ways. It should be emphasized that the Russians are now utilizing, you can say, the core elements of Prometheanism against the multi-ethnic Second Polish Republic.
It's a very good point, because it brings us back to what you raised earlier about how Ukrainian nationalism as such really only appears towards the end of the 19th century, and during that time, as a counter move, the Russians began to agitate in the eastern parts of Ukraine to create their own um, claims and policies. So even the Ukrainian nationalism of the late 19th century has its own divisions and splits, and there is a Russian variant of it in the East that we're seeing, bear fruit today, with the Russian claims to be able to step in and assist those Russian-speaking regions in the East. So that's a very good point, well taken, and one that I will remember. What did you say again was the name of the Russian policy as a counterpoint?
Colonization. I'm sure if you just type in indigenization or putting down roots, you can get it. But again, it's necessary to understand that we're not just talking about the Russian Empire. We're talking about the Soviet Union. I'm not trying to be an apologist, of course, for the Soviet Union, but the Soviets tried in the 1920s to extol a policy which was deliberately anti-Russian empire, in the sense that we are not restoring a Russian ethnic hegemonic state. Instead, we are trying to set the stage for an assimilation of a global empire, a global socialist state, which is going to be united by the unification of the proletariat class as a factor, rather than nationality as a factor. And in order to create the Soviet state, we must embrace the cosmopolitan nature of the Soviet Union, effectively, in order to absorb and amalgamate these other nations. However, when Stalin fully takes over the Soviet Union in the 1930s, the Soviet Union begins to resemble the old Russian Empire, and it begins to pursue policies congruent with old Russian aims towards pan-Slavism, you can say. So when I look at the Soviet border issue here before the Nazi-Soviet pact, I am left thinking that from Stalin's point of view, this is less, even though Kolonization has already been established at this point, and there are attempts, even going as so far as basically to make Ukrainian the only spoken language in schools within the new defined territories of Ukraine within the Soviet Union. I believe here that we're seeing a policy which is as much inspired by the restoration of the boundaries of the old Russian Empire and by Pan-Slavism, the unification of all Eastern ethnic Slavs and great, Slavs in general, rather than just extolling the virtues of Kolonization. But all of these things are taking place to weaken, you can say, the legitimacy of the Second Polish Republic, whilst at the same time, you can see with the German populations here, especially around Danzig, that the Germans have their own irredentist claims. But the Poles are the last victim of this. Obviously we have the Anschluss. In 1938, we have the Sudetendeutsche, who are annexed into Germany in 1938 as per the Munich Conference. And this is significant because not only does it outline the policies set in Germany which would prove fatal to Poland, but it also illustrates the fact that the West has lost, the point I was making earlier, its confidence in upholding this artificial order which has been created in the East. So by extension, them surrendering Czechoslovakia, albeit they will come to Poland's aid very, very nominally, it should be pointed out, with the phony war from 1939 until 1940, they have already tacitly acknowledged that Germany and Russia will come to dominate this region. There are attempts made, very half-hearted attempts, by the French to woo the Soviets. But in the end, what Hitler can promise Stalin is something the French cannot promise, because it contradicts everything that we've set up here, which is Hitler can promise Stalin territorial conquests as a result of the Nazi-Soviet pact. So thereby it makes complete sense from the point of view of Germany and the Soviets to make this pact, but also for Germany, if they are going to pursue a war against France and Great Britain, this also ensures that there is no Eastern Front. So what we're seeing here is returning to two things, which I previously mentioned. One, of course, the obvious one, is returning to the partitions of Poland, organized by the Soviet Union and National Socialist Germany. But we're also seeing a scenario play out like 1863, which is the Poles are crushed by the Russians with the acquiescence of the Prussians, and the Prussians then go on to fight a war in the Western Front, which they do very successfully, as indeed they do very successfully in 1940. So there are many historical parallels that have been played out over and over again, and in this situation, of course, Germany does very well on the Western Front, and then it attacks the Soviet Union. And I'm not sure whether it's really relevant to bring Poland as a factor into the situation with the Eastern invasion, the Operation Barbarossa, etc., and the war in the East from 1941 up and really until 1944, because obviously Germany had no interest in doing what the Central Powers did in the First World War, which is restoring Poland and using Poland as a means of annexing further territories in the East. They only very tentatively adopted aspects of Ukrainian nationalism as well, but it was only Ukrainian nationalism insofar as it would support German interests, unlike what we see in the First World War. In fact, when we look at the Polish situation within the Third Reich, vast amounts of Poland were directly incorporated into Germany, such as the Warthegau and such as West Prussia. The rest of Poland, which wasn't annexed directly into Greater Germany, was created as the General Government region, which was supposed to be the nominal government of an autonomous Poland. But in reality, it would have served as an intermediary stage towards the direct annexation of these territories into Germany as well. So here, the Germans are trying to solve the Polish question by wiping Poland off the map. Indeed, as the Soviets are annexing these territories from the east. And this is where we get to really the last sort of aspect of the conversation, which brings us into the modern situation, which is the modern border situation. When the tide against Germany turned in World War II, and obviously we're talking about Allied war aims and goals and how to divvy up Germany in 1944 and 1945, as you can see, Germany loses a significant amount of territory, even by their reduced 1939 borders in the east that you can see here. And this comes off the back of massive ethnic cleansing. When we talk about the wholesale removal of the Ostdeutsche, with only a couple of enclaves existing in Hungary and Romania, and a large German segment being relocated to Kazakhstan, we see the depopulation of roughly 10 million Germans, not only in this new created Poland, and with the Sudetendeutsche as well, who are evicted from Czechoslovakia. And you see another historical contrivance, which is restoring these ancient borders, which I brought up at the beginning here, which is the Oder-Neissau line, as the quote-unquote natural border separating Poland from the rest of Germany. But of course, this also serves a diplomatic goal for the Soviets as well, because they can now justify their annexation of these various territories from Poland, which obviously were ratified by the original Nazi-Soviet pact, by saying we'll compensate Poland by giving them these much wealthier territories in the West, Silesia, Pomerania, the Ostmark, etc. And even added to this, the Russians also annexed territories further west into Ukraine and Carpathian Ruthenia, which was part of Czechoslovakia, then briefly Hungary, and then finally annexed into the Soviet Union. So here, what we see is almost a return to this situation here, whereby Poland is being used as a buffer and a state which is ruled indirectly by the Russians as a way of preventing an invasion of Russia by Germany, even though it wouldn't have been Germany during this time, it would have been Germany under the auspices of NATO and the Western alliances. But in terms of trying to find some sort of historical precedent to it, I would look to 1765 and Catherine the Great and her puppet government ruling over Poland again, except this is a Poland which is much further to the west and thereby much more conducive to Russia's goals of uniting all the Belarusians, all the Ukrainians, and of course restoring the Baltic states and incorporating them into the Soviet Union as Soviet Socialist republics. And of course, Poland isn't the only important consideration here. We have a restored Czechoslovakia, we have a restored Romania, we have a reduced Hungary, and we have, of course, East Germany, which basically acts as a Soviet colony during this time. And as you can see, for the maintenance of the Warsaw Pact, Poland is actually pretty essential. Without Poland linking all of these territories, especially East Germany and Czechoslovakia together, then the buffer state network, which keeps NATO at bay for the Soviet Union, effectively collapses. And of course, it does collapse. And not only does Poland switch sides and become a member of the European Union and NATO, but the Soviet Union itself collapses, where we arrive in this situation where the Baltic states are once more Western aligned, and the only noteworthy state in the West, which is Russia aligned, is of course Belarus. And of course, if we're looking at Polish revanchist aims, i.e. the Allies wanting to return to the situation that you see here, where Poland should have its borders pushed back as far sort of east against Russia as possible, then of course you have the Kaliningrad Oblast enclave, which is still controlled by Russia in the north, and of course you have Belarus again. And then you add Ukraine into this, and it throws a whole sort of different sort of question into the mix as to what extent the Poles are supporting Ukraine to get at the Russians, or they're supporting Ukraine with the hope of more influence or even possibly direct annexations of territories in the West back to Poland. But all of these questions are now opened up as a result of the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the post-World War II situation, where Poland and a westerly Poland had been envisaged by the Soviet Union as a way of maintaining the Soviet Union. And now here, ironically, Poland has been used by NATO to fulfill that opposite purpose.
Yes, when someone reaches out an arm towards you, as my old friend Tim used to say, he's just giving you a handle, so to speak. So you've got a situation where the Russians have tried to extend westward, and ironically, that there's the handle, so to speak, as they reached out, and it's being turned back against them. We certainly saw that the Western powers went to considerable pains to attempt to peel Belarus off from Russia here just recently. Only over the last few years, and that seems to have been the point at which Russia said not just no, but hell no, because this is getting out of hand. It would have certainly, if they'd been able to get Belarus, they could have eventually, even more thoroughly encircled Königsberg, whatever it's called again today.
Kaliningrad, yeah.
Kaliningrad, that's right.
Yes, sorry, Kaliningrad. Kalinin was a Soviet era head of state, and they decided he died, I think, very shortly after Soviet victory in World War II. So they decided to rename Königsberg, which of course means the City of Kings, in honor of Kalinin. And the area was completely depopulated from ethnic German Prussians and was resettled by Russians. So it is basically a Russian colony. And there had been even attempts to rename it from Kaliningrad to another disgusting name, Kantgrad, in honor of Immanuel Kant.
Good God. Well, this is probably a good point, so as not to give you a terrible sore throat and inability to speak for the next week, since you've been carrying the full weight of this so expertly. This might be a point to ask some, I guess, the most important sort of final questions from my perspective. But before doing so, I do just want to observe that point you made about the Soviet Union in its early days wanting to go for this cosmopolitan internationalist thing, and then Stalin comes along and says, no, we're gonna sort of turn the nationalist engines to a certain extent and benefit from exploiting the understandable national interests of these different regions, then the whole thing falls apart. And it does so starting with Poland. I was around seeing the news and the headlines at the time. The collapse of the Warsaw Pact arrangement really begins with Poland, showing again that it's a keystone. We see World War II breaking out because of Poland. We see the fall of the Warsaw Pact happening with Poland, and we see Poland now today playing a central role in attempts to push things further east, of course, backed by the United States and Britain. The major U.S. involvement here being the big difference that we see in terms of all these various historical pictures. At any rate, today we see that Putin seems to be trying very carefully to cleave to this idea of a kind of civic nationalist Russia, based on the idea that all these groups are together, not with any kind of pan-Slavism, and he tends to push back against that. And when you do see other strange ideas appear, people like Dugin, whom I'll confess I don't fully understand. He certainly says, from what I can tell, screw Europe. We don't even need to look that direction. We can look further to the east. But those are just off the cuff observations. The real sort of question I want to get at here was that point I stuck a flag in earlier, where you have the idea of Poland sort of being propped up based on the interest of one group of powers. And then there's a very quick turnabout, that I'm calling this, the glass goes from being half full to being half empty, or vice versa, where Poland is suddenly being supported by a different group of powers for a very different set of reasons. And, this is also part of why I brought up this business of Stalin and Mustache Man having agreed to just say, you know what, screw Poland. This is really getting to be a pain in our asses. Let's just divide it between us and be done with this mess that just continuously gives us headaches. So I sort of have a two major questions. One is, Poland is now, I don't think you'd have any Germans who would feel comfortable enough to state it explicitly, but there have to be a lot of pissed off Germans right now, a lot of them, and pissed off with Poland, not just because Poland is saying, now you have to pay us reparations for World War II if you don't mind your manners, but also getting supported so heavily, being militarized so heavily, and with all the events that we see going on here now with the absolute catastrophic blows via energy to German industry and German standing within the European Union. You've got a Germany that has to look over and go, maybe it's not all Poland's fault, but them being propped up by the United States and to a considerable extent by the United Kingdom, this is really getting to be a pain in our asses again. And then over on the other side, you've got Russia doubtless thinking to itself, Poland is really beginning to be a pain in our ass. So you've got Germany on one side and Russia on the other, the classic, Scylla and Charybdis for Poland. And Poland's just doing everything within its power, or it's at least the regime in power there is backed by the United States, to irritate both of those parties once again. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about the potential direction there. The other question, and perhaps it's one that's related here. Well, first off, I should add to that, this is a case where you could see it maybe flip and from glass half full to glass half empty, in terms of Poland maybe continuing to exist for a different set of reasons and under a different set of rules, given how it's got to be pissing Germany off. And I'm not suggesting, of course, that Germany could do anything at this point militarily, but economically, I would not count them out of the game. If you have a group of old school industrial powers in Germany, and they're looking at their coming annihilation for all intents and purposes because of decisions that have been made by the United States and others relative to Poland, I could see where they could become motivated to do certain things economically. And I don't doubt that the United States is trying to block that, has blocked it in a number of respects. I mean, the Nord Stream stuff was clearly a part of this picture. So anyway, that's sort of the one element, which is, in the past, Poland pissed off Russia and Germany, and they, behind the scenes, they shook hands behind the curtain and said, "No, screw these people. Let's just divide it amongst ourselves." Could we be looking at the motivations, leaving aside the capability, certainly on Germany's part, but could we be looking again at the motivations returning to have some such thing happen? And then the other question is, given what we've reviewed historically, what would the grand strategy Polish politicians be thinking today? How do they feel that they're going to get out of this? Certainly, they have to know that they're going to fall very much under the boot of what gets called the gay. Um, they must know that they're playing this risk. They must know that they're pissing off Germany. They must know that they're pissing off Russia, and they must know that the United States has a tendency to just swiftly back out of relationships, even alliances, when it suits them, leaving people hanging in the most ridiculous way. I mean, look at what happened after World War II, which we're told was started to protect the territorial integrity of Poland. And then at the end of it, it was like, Poles, who are they? I don't know. Who are Poles? Who gives a shit? I guess it's all in Russia's control now. What possibly could the grand strategy, historically aware, intelligent Polish politicians today be thinking for what they're going to end up with as a result of all of this?
Right. To try and answer the first question, I am very cynical that the Germans will do anything, even economically. Their entire political leadership is based around this idea of perpetual national emasculation. And I'm sorry to say, no offense to any Germans, I'm not obviously applying this universally, but the German sort of population in terms of a political mass, which can actually exert a change in foreign affairs, they really do seem to be indoctrinated into this collective sense of sadomasochism. I'm really sorry to say that, but Germany is an anti-nation. It is a vacuum of nationalism. It seems incapable of exerting itself, even within the European context. I view it as a conquered nation, and I simply believe, therefore, it will put up with these Polish demands and maybe even acquiesce to more economic and military concessions towards Poland. However, in terms of trying to bring this back to a historical political context, it's interesting, however, considering that both Poland and France gain, even within the context of the European Union, from an emasculated Germany. France, despite being a member of NATO and despite being very pro policies, which have been pushed by the United States, France, post de Gaulle, considers itself a great power in its own right, as deluded as that may seem. It is a nuclear power. It is a major military power. And anything that weakens Germany and supports a power which could potentially lay some potential counterweight to Germany, i.e. Poland, will be most welcome. In fact, what I see this as is potentially the restoration of a Duchy of Warsaw and a Napoleonic France situation, where there is a vested interest in France and the Americans and the Poles to keep Germany constrained. And indeed, in this scenario, Prussia, Germany does not have the material capacity, the willingness from the population to be able to resist these forces effectively in order to bring about some radical transformation in policy, which I think could only be accelerated by some sort of military coup, which I think very unlikely, or a dramatic about turn in the democratic politics of the state, which I think, even given the situation with the AfD, is virtually impossible in Germany of all situations. I think it's far more likely that France, given ironically the situation which I've laid out, is more likely to take an about turn vis-a-vis the United States at least. When it comes to your second point about what a historically aware Polish leadership will be invested in terms of the implications of this current conflict, I believe that a larger Ukraine, a Ukraine which, even though this may seem rather inconceivable, wins the war with Russia territorially and is able to not only reincorporate areas such as Kherson and restore essentially the entirety of the east, Luhansk and Donetsk, and is able to reconquer Crimea. In that situation, I think Poland loses because Ukraine becomes potentially a major power with a vast amount of US backing and investment and the installation of military bases and incorporated into the European Union. What I think Poland would benefit from would be a dismembered and weakened Ukraine, which is integrated to a much greater extent within the nexus of NATO and the European Union. A smaller Ukraine in which Poland, within the grand scheme of things, can act as this, if going back to this map here, this middle power, this regional giant in the intermarium. And therefore, I think a small Ukraine, but a Ukraine very much organized within the context of the Western alliance, very much benefits Poland. As for potential direct military annexations, I think obviously given the fact that Russia is a nuclear power, it is very unlikely that the Poles would say, for example, want to take Kaliningrad Oblast, even though taking Kaliningrad would be the most logical step in terms of preventing Russia from having significant naval access in the Baltic Sea, and will obviously relieve some of the pressure placed on Poland militarily from Russia. But at the same time, I actually think that benefits Poland. I think given the fact that Poland has a direct border with Russia, which everyone seems to forget, and that Belarus borders Poland as well, means that Poland does become that military necessity for the West, for the Americans. And so the Americans, and by extension NATO, have every reason to move military bases there and elevate Poland vis-a-vis Germany. So I think in the situation, ironically, the worse things go for Ukraine in the war, Poland becomes more of that European necessity that we see during the interwar phase with the Second Polish Republic. And like the Second Polish Republic, Poland has significant natural resources and a large population where potentially it could exert a similar level of influence. But those are just my sort of my that's just pure conjecture, but that's how I would consider it.
Yeah, I think that's very, very well observed. Very well observed, because it fits together with what we've already seen. The first thing is, and I've mentioned this in previous streams, that no matter what happens, victory or defeat in Ukraine for the West, it improves the position of the United States. Though much more so in terms of all the individual crooked investments, doubtless, that the various regime players have made. You know, if they lose Ukraine, they lose a whole lot of money and a lot of their standing. But the powers behind the scenes in the United States, I think, will certainly benefit in either case. Another country that I've seen that has certainly benefited enormously from all of this straight out of the gate is China. I mean, the benefits that they've seen as a result of this conflict are huge. You know, Russia has now come over and is forced into a relationship with them. Many people have talked about this, so I won't go into it at length here. But it also, you know, Russia was previously in a position where it did not want to irritate the West too much, and so would not support Iran as much as it could. And now Russia's doing that. And of course, this all works out for China, because they're increasingly looking like they're going to be able to run a Belt and Road route south of Russia, that, you know, would mean that their interior supply lines and logistics could not be interrupted as easily by Russia as it would be the case, say, if those logistical lines had to cross Russian territory. So, you know, and this brings Iran on side for these people more, now that you've got, I mean, for China, and to some extent for Russia, now that things are shaking out the way they are. But that bit about the defeat of Ukraine actually making things even better for Poland, it fits very much with what I've talked about in the past about how, win or lose, NATO now has a brand new mandate, a brand new reason for being, a brand new excuse for existing. And that will be amplified through rhetoric and the usual controls, mass media, if there is a failure in Ukraine, because, as you say, the next block on the board defensively is Poland, and so all the investment must pour in there. So NATO gets a shot in the arm, um, very much so. But I think the really interesting thing that I had not considered and had not made any sense to me, I wasn't aware of it, hadn't thought about it at all, and as a result of your review of the history, um, is France. France is, I mean, and they've been very quiet too. They say, well, we'll send ammunition, we'll send support, we'll send money, much like all these European countries. But, they hem and they haw about whether they'll send fighter jets and whether or not they'll send some tanks and armored vehicles. And they're being quiet behind the scenes. But only now that you've pointed this stuff out, I can see that France could be a huge winner here, relative to what's going on with Germany. Now they're going to have to balance things out with Poland, but given their historical relationships, it probably seems to them as though something that in coming years diplomatically can be worked out just fine by them, and can be made to suit them. Yeah, so France is the big one that I had not been considering in this respect. That is a major winner as well. So that's very, very, very interesting.
Thank
Anything else that you would
y-
add?
Thank you. There's one little thing which I'd like to bring up, which I forgot, and I should have brought it up when I was giving my summary of Poland and the military situation with the Russian border, which is of course the Suwalki corridor. What is fascinating about the Suwalki corridor is that it gives Poland a particular leverage over Russia, which no other NATO power really has. But ironically, also, it is almost a way of bringing Poland and Lithuania together against Russia in a, you can almost say, a pseudo restoration of the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth. The fact that they both have a mutual interest in pressuring Russia over the only land link which connects the Kaliningrad Oblast back to Belarus and by extension into Russia in general. So just that one little point to consider, that unique bargaining chip Poland has. Of course, I think it very unlikely that Poland will do anything so stupid, but nevertheless, the potentiality is there. But I think that's really the only point I would make other than that. And of course, if we were to look at Prometheanism in general, then we can look, say, for example, at the attempted various color revolutions in Kazakhstan, the recent, say, for example, agitation in Georgia. You've already mentioned the situation in Moldova, and all of these things would be congruent with what we saw with the aftermath of World War One and the retreat of Red Russia, and obviously with the situation as we saw with the intermarium. So a lot of historical parallels, which I think are pretty obvious once you arrange them in a certain way.
Yes, and the more you point out the importance in Poland, the sort of geostrategic realities indicating that there's going to have to be what we're already seeing, of course, which is major investment in empowering and strengthening Poland, and militarily, and the aspects of getting rid of all this Warsaw Pact era gear, all the many APCs and jets and tanks and artillery systems that have been, basically have to be thrown on the scrap heap now because they've been eaten up through the attrition of war. That creates a basis for developing infrastructure and shared military standards that will make the de facto integration of Poland and Lithuania and perhaps these other countries in the north there. It makes it more of a reality. And we see with the planning for an intermarium and the Three Seas initiative that these countries will, to a considerable extent, be brought together. And that's planned in the future. The only thing I would throw in as a bit of raw speculation here at the end is that to the extent that Poland becomes a new bulwark, and the Baltic countries are, and the rest of them there in the north, um, they are armed and reinforced and everything, I think it makes it much, much more important that Russia regain some ground going into Europe to have leverage of its own. So I would expect that Moldova, certainly Transnistria, is not going to remain over on the sidelines for very much longer. I also think that there's going to be a major push to bring Bulgaria back on side with Russia, and I don't think the story is over yet as regards Serbia as well. Despite the fact that these days it seems like the Gay has been successful with cutting it off with from sea access to the Adriatic via Montenegro. Basically, what I'm saying is, as you see the Western forces assert themselves more strongly around Poland and in the Baltic and bringing Finland online as a NATO country and the rest, I think you're going to see the Russians wheel about in the Balkans and in the South, where they have their historical relationships, to counterbalance that in some ways and continue to have um, a lever to pull, so to speak, in the form of Serbia and perhaps other countries it can bring on side closer to Central Europe. Anyway, just a guess. I do have to say, man, it's always a great pleasure having you on. Not only because I learn things, but also because you just entirely elevate the quality and the presentation of my channel. I can pick the hay out of my hair and listen to someone really hold forth properly on the historical aspects. So thank you very, very much for coming on and for having laid all of this out. Is there anything further that you want to lay out that we missed, or any points that didn't make it into the discussion?
Well, nothing that we've missed, but just really to reinforce your point about Romania, because obviously, looking at this map here, Transnistria is a small autonomous Russian enclave bordering Moldova. Moldova, of course, is ethnically Romanian, and indeed the only reason it isn't part of Romania is because it was ceded to the Soviet Union twice during the course of the Second World War and became the Moldovan Soviet Socialist Republic. The reason I bring it up, of course, if we're looking for other historical parallels, is the fact that it wasn't just Poland that was expended eastwards in order to halt Soviet gains. Of course, we have a greater Romania here, a Romania which was allied to Poland and provides a bulwark against the Soviet Union. And indeed, Romania was essential in terms of Polish strategy vis-a-vis Germany as well. The Romanian bridgehead strategy allowed a significant amount of the Polish army and the Polish Air Force to evacuate Poland via Romania, to transport out via the Black Sea, and then, of course, regroup in London, where they formed a significant contingent during the Battle of Britain, especially regarding the Air Force. And, of course, Polish contingents fought alongside the Allies as well. So don't underestimate the Romanian situation as well, and the Romanians and the Polish becoming much closer as a result of the Ukrainian situation. Because indeed, if we look at this map territorially, as a result of the contrivance of the Soviet Union in 1945, Poland and Romania no longer have a land bridge together. It's split off by Carpathia and Ruthenia. But I think a smaller allied Ukraine would only facilitate and necessitate reciprocal relationships between Romania, placing that pressure on Serbia, Transnistria, Moldova to solidify European Union, NATO, by extension, American control in the Balkans, as Poland fulfills that role in the north and with the Baltic Sea. And again, just one novel point to bring in here. Throughout most of its history, Sweden has been antagonistic towards Poland. And this will be one of those rare moments where Sweden and Poland are finally on the same side again. When I think there was one monarch from the Vasa dynasty in the 16th century where there was at one point where Sweden, Finland, and Poland and Lithuania were all the same, were all ruled over by the same monarch. Just a weird historical parallel, as in to throw in the significance of NATO and Sweden joining Sweden and Finland joining NATO at this time and allying with Poland seems to be a restoration of this old 16th century Commonwealth idea. But that's a very tangential point. But other than that, just thank you very much for having me on, and I like having these sort of this opportunity to conjecture and offer these sort of historical parallels. I enjoy it. So thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Anytime. Absolutely. Anytime. So, ladies and gentlemen, please do absolutely head over to Apostolic Majesty's channel. I imagine almost everyone here must know of him already, but you get the same sort of excellent discourse on historical facts and trajectories over there on his channel, and there are scores of videos on various topics now. So definitely head over there and follow him. You can also do that on Twitter as well. He has great guests that come on at various times. I've been on here and there. Furious Pertinax and Columba are regulars, so you'll see them or hear them as a part of the discussion in many of these videos. So again, head over to Apostolic Majesty's channel, click the little thing to follow the channel, and click the bell for notifications. Thank you, one and all, everyone, for coming in to check this out. Again, my thanks to you, AM. And until next time, ladies and gentlemen, I am Semiagog, and I am out.